What an audience, what a turnout. Thank you so much for being here on Monday night. My name is Max Kovalov. I'm the director of the Mroz Global Leadership Institute. The mission of the Mroz Global Leadership Institute is to provide our students with essential skills of global fluency and help educate the next generation of students about diplomacy. This speaker series serves a very particular, an important role towards this mission, and it's designed to bring prominent speakers with international experience to campus so that they would stimulate conversations with our faculty, students, and members of the Charleston community. Thank you for being with us tonight, and after our speakers' remarks, there will be some time for Q&A. And now I want to invite to the stage one of the global ambassadors of the Mroz Global Leadership Institute, Sid Jackson. She will introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening, everyone. It is my honor to introduce our speaker, David J. Firestein. David J. Firestein is the inaugural president and CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations, also known as the Bush-China Foundation, and a founding and current member of the foundation's board of directors. Prior to joining the Bush-China Foundation, Mr. Firestein was the founding executive director of the UT, University of Texas at Austin's China Public Policy Center, and a professor at UT's Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs. Before moving to UT, Mr. Firestein served as Senior Vice President and Parrott Fellow at the New York City-based East-West Institute, where he led the Institute's two-track diplomacy work in the areas of U.S.-China relations, East Asian security, and U.S.-Russia relations. From 1992 to 2010, Firestein was a U.S. diplomat. He served overseas in the embassies at Beijing and in Moscow, and a number of positions in Washington, D.C. This is Mr. Firestein's third time at the College of Charleston, and we warmly welcome him back.
Well, Sid, thank you so much for the wonderful and very gracious introduction. And Sid, it's great to see you again. I remember meeting you when you were a freshman, and now you're a senior, and you've done some incredible things. And thank you so much for introducing me. And Max, thank you so much. And for all who were involved in helping me be here this evening, I'm very grateful to be back for a third time here at this wonderful university, the College of Charleston. And it brings back a lot of fond memories, and I'm so grateful to all of you for giving the generous gift of your time and being here this evening to engage on a really important topic that I'm sure is on the minds of many of us, and that's the issue of the U.S.-China relationship and what the second presidential term of Donald Trump means for the relationship at a really interesting moment in the world and inflection point, I would say, for the relationship and for many issues that are going on right now. And I'm delighted to be back and to be able to address this with you. I will keep my eyes on the clock here so that I don't go longer than I should, because I do want to leave plenty of time for questions initially from the students who are here, and thank you so much to the students who are here, as well as members of the general public. And so I'll condense down what would normally be maybe a 45 or 50-minute talk to, I hope, about 35 minutes or so. Per the guidance that I got from Max, and then I look forward to our conversation. I want to talk about a couple of different things this evening. First, I want to talk about the emerging contours of the second Trump administration's overall policy posture toward China. And what's interesting about it, as I'll describe in a little bit more detail here in a minute, is that there are elements of the Trump approach to China that seem to continue the hardline or hawkish approach to China that we saw materialize in President Trump's first term, and frankly, that continued to a very large degree in President Biden's term. But there are also elements of President Trump's approach and his team's approach to China that are much more conciliatory than perhaps many of us would have expected. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Then I want to say a little bit about something that is very rarely discussed, and in fact, I'm not sure it's ever discussed in a thoroughgoing way, but that is the strategic assumptions that undergird U.S. policy toward China. So we can talk about policies and we can talk about what the United States is doing on issue A or issue B where it pertains to China. But an interesting question is, what are the strategic assumptions that are the predicate for, the premise for the policy choices that we're making? And I want to talk a little bit about what those assumptions used to be and what they are today and the degree to which they've changed. And then I'll say a few words about assessing what I refer to as the Trump-Biden policy toward China. And this is an opportune moment for me to make a point that may not seem intuitive to a lot of people who look at our politics and see it very understandably as being very polarized and very divided. But the interesting thing that one recognizes when one looks at U.S. policy toward China, dating back to President Trump becoming president in 2017 and through the Biden 4 years, that 8-year period had a very high degree of continuity to it. And so policies that Donald Trump put in place as president starting in 2017 and in particular starting in 2018 with the tariffs and so on, to a very large degree continued under President Biden. Some of the rhetoric changed, some of the language, the tonality changed, a few things changed here and there, but in many respects, and I would say in most respects, the Biden approach to China from a substantive policy standpoint was indistinguishable from President Trump's approach to China. And so I'll talk, and you'll hear me talk about the Trump-Biden policies, and I'll, as I mentioned, talk a little bit about my assessment of the efficacy of this set of policies as measured by the only metric that actually matters, which is, did we, the United States, achieve our stated goals via these policies? And I'll say a few words about that. And after that, I'll conclude, again, I'll try to give you a somewhat condensed or briefer version of this talk than I might normally do. So let me start with President Trump 2.0, the second presidential term of President Donald Trump, and talk about areas of continuity with the hardline policies that he initiated and that Biden continued, but then also talk about some of the areas where I think we're seeing a departure. So first, in terms of elements of policy that we now see coming into focus that are more on the hardline side of the U.S. approach to China, I would point to two things in particular, and there are other things that could be discussed. This is not an exhaustive list, but two things in particular seem to show a degree of continuity with the previous 8 years. Number one is trade, and number two is technology. Let me just say a couple of things about that. It seems very clear that President Trump is intent on continuing and deepening what was a pretty hardline or hawkish approach to China on the issue of trade. And as President Trump himself has said many times, and it is very clear to all of us, he continues to want to rely on the tool of tariffs in order to try to bring about some of the changes that he says he would like to see in Chinese economic and trade behavior, and frankly, in other areas of Chinese behavior as well. So just in the last 2 months since President Trump took office on January 20th, we have seen 2 increases in tariffs on a vast swath of Chinese goods coming into this country. The first one was another 10% increase from what had already been done. And by the way, something that Biden kept in place during his 4 years. So again, Trump-Biden policies. And now we just recently, earlier this month, saw yet another 10% increase in tariffs on Chinese imports added to the other 10% added to those that took effect in the first term. So we see a very high level of tariffs on Chinese imports coming into the United States. And this is an example of a hardline policy that this administration is embarking on again in its second term. The second area of kind of hardline policy is this area of technology. And I would argue that the area of technology really is arguably the single most contentious area on a day-to-day basis in the U.S.-China relationship, perhaps even more than trade itself. We hear a lot about trade, and we hear a lot about deficits, and we hear a lot about tariffs, but on a day-to-day basis, the competition between the United States and China in the area of technology is probably the single most intense element of competition between our two countries. And make no mistake, it is a competition to see which country can become the technology superpower of the 21st century. That's what is at stake. That's how both countries see it. And which country can ultimately reign supreme in this competition for things like capability in artificial intelligence or AI, quantum physics, quantum computing, advanced robotics, and a number of other very sensitive and very important areas for the 21st century economy. And what we saw initially with President Trump, but what we saw even more with President Biden, it was an effort on the part of the United States to restrict technology flows to China, to restrict incoming investment from China where it bumped up against presumably sensitive technologies, and to basically get involved with commercial decision-making and place restrictions on what used to be commercial activities in this country, where commercial companies, private sector companies, could make decisions about what they sold and what they didn't sell. And under both Trump and especially under President Biden, we saw an effort on the part of the US federal government to curtail that. So these two elements, trade and technology, are the two elements that we see so far that suggest to me that we're going to see a continued hawkish or hardline element to the United States approach to China as we get in earnest into the second term of President Trump. Now, on the other side of the ledger, there are a number of indications that we already see that, perhaps to the surprise of many observers, President Trump is actually taking now a considerably more conciliatory approach toward China than President Biden did, and then other U.S. presidents have that the administration has over the last 8 years, whether under the first term of President Trump or the first term and the only term of President Biden. So we see some, in some ways, jarring data points that suggest a higher degree of conciliation. And there are 4 things that I want to mention here as distinct from the 2 points that I mentioned under the hardline category. And the 4 points I want to mention are Taiwan, TikTok, human rights, and the issue of the Russia-Ukraine war. And I'll say a little bit about each of those, and you'll see what I mean. I think the biggest single issue and the potentially most explosive issue for U.S.-China relations, the one issue that potentially, and I'm not saying it will, but potentially could lead to a U.S.-China kinetic military conflict, is the issue of Taiwan. Now, when President Biden was president, he did something that no president, either Republican or Democrat, had ever done before him subsequent to the United States and China normalizing our diplomatic relations, the U.S. derecognizing Taiwan and recognizing the People's Republic of China. President Biden said on 4 different occasions, as the commander-in-chief of our armed forces, that he would commit U.S. troops to the defense of Taiwan in the event that China attacked Taiwan toward the end of trying to generate so-called reunification or unification. And 4 different times, again, it wasn't a slip of the tongue, it wasn't a gaffe, it was very intentional. It was on 60 Minutes in one case, and it was very clear that this president, President Biden, was going to a place in terms of U.S. policy regarding Taiwan that no president had gone to, and actually making an explicit commitment to defend Taiwan. Now, President Trump thinks about and speaks about Taiwan very differently. And this is an area where I think it is fair to say that President Trump, based on what he himself has said, and I'll cite one example of that in a second, is taking what can only be described as a much more conciliatory tone and positioning on the issue of Taiwan than his predecessor, President Biden. In an interview in Bloomberg last year, on the record, if you Google Trump Bloomberg interview in Taiwan, you'll see the transcript online. In an interview last year, President Trump was asked by a journalist from Bloomberg whether he would do what President Biden said that he would do. and that is whether President Trump, as president, if elected, this was back in the summer of last year before he was elected, whether a President Trump would or would not commit troops to defending Taiwan. And President Trump stated, and here I'm paraphrasing his own words very closely, he said, well, I would only defend Taiwan if they were paying us, but not if they weren't paying us. And he went further and he said, and these are very close to his exact words, he said, Taiwan should look at the United States the way that a customer looks at an insurance company. If you pay your premiums, then you'll get the protection that the insurance company promises. But if you don't pay, we don't play. You don't pay me, I don't protect you. That is exactly what President Trump said in just slightly different words, but exactly that meaning. So it became very transactional and very much a pay-to-play type of a mindset. So my point is, if you listen to those words, and he said similar things, by the way, subsequent to that, including as president, where he declined to answer a question from a journalist just about 4 weeks ago, an on-the-record question, it was on TV, and he declined to say whether he would, in fact, commit troops to defend Taiwan or whether he would be supportive of Taiwan in this type of eventuality. If you're sitting in Beijing, in the leadership compound of Zhongnan High, this is music to your ears, to hear a US president wavering from what had been a very hardline position. So that's issue number one. I'll be brief on these others. TikTok. Has anybody here ever heard of TikTok? I know some of the younger folks have, not necessarily everyone in the room. But yes, TikTok is an important issue. When Trump was president the first time around, he was against TikTok being available in the United States on the grounds that TikTok, which is a Chinese-owned company, could potentially collect harmful information about, I guess, the viewing habits of young people in this country and so on, and that it represented a security threat to the United States, and he was adamantly against TikTok being available. Last year, I think it was last year, it may have been the year before, but I believe it was 2024, the United States Congress passed a bill on a very bipartisan basis, maybe the single most bipartisan piece of legislation passed in Washington in the last several years, banning TikTok unless they change their ownership to get out of Chinese ownership. And President Biden signed it into law and strongly supported the concept of it. Now, President Trump has said that he is in favor, he has reversed his position, and he has said and acted upon the statement that he is in favor of TikTok being available in this country indefinitely and in the future. And he has declined to implement the law that a bipartisan large majority passed and that President Biden signed, and is now, in essence, allowing TikTok to remain in the United States. So this is an area that, again, if you're China, you're saying, wow, that's quite a turnaround, and that is much more conciliatory than his initial position. But that's where President Trump says that he is, and that's the actions that he's taken as president. On human rights, just in short, it's fair to say that President Trump has never spoken much. This is just a matter of record. It's a matter of the presidential transcripts. You can analyze what he's said about China, and he's said a lot about China, as we all know. But he doesn't say much about human rights in China. I think all of us that understand China and that have lived there and worked there or that read the papers, et cetera, understand that China's human rights record is deplorable. But President Trump himself has declined to be critical of human rights in China for most of the 10 years that he's been in public life. In fact, his own national security advisor, John Bolton, wrote in his book that in a meeting that he participated in where it was the two presidents and the two national security advisors and the interpreter, Bolton said that Trump expressed admiration for the way that President Xi Jinping was handling human rights in China. That's what President Trump's own national security advisor wrote in his book. So I think it's fair to say that from a Chinese standpoint, there is a sense of relief that whatever criticism emanates from the United States toward China in terms of human rights, it's not going to be from President Trump. And I think that's a fair assessment based on the 4 years that President Trump was in office. Here again, I think it's a conciliatory posture. There were some hardline postures, and this is another conciliatory one. And finally, on the issue of Russia-Ukraine, you know, up until the inauguration of President Trump for his second term, just on January 20th of this year, the United States had made the decision with strong bipartisan support in Congress, where the money comes from, after all, for the assistance that we've provided to Ukraine, that the United States should stand with Ukraine and stand against Vladimir Putin. That has changed. Now, why is this a US-China issue? Because one of the major foreign policy objectives of the United States over the last 3 years, and it's been almost exactly 3 years and a month, since Russia aggressed against Ukraine and unlawfully and without any provocation or justification invaded Ukraine in an absolute categorical violation of all relevant international law. We're at the 3-year mark plus a month. Since that time, one of the objectives of the United States relative to China has been to get China to not tilt toward Moscow, but rather to condemn Moscow and to not supply valuable trade solutions, if you will, to Russia's economic problems, and above all, to not supply military hardware, but also dual-use sensitive technology to Russia in ways that would aid Russia in prosecuting this deplorable and unjust war against Ukraine. And that was the policy of the United States from the day that Russia invaded Ukraine until January 20th. But President Trump has, as we all have seen on TV and in his own statements, reversed the US position. It's fair to say that. I'll give you a data point that makes that clear here in a second. Even to the point of saying on the record that it was his belief that Ukraine started the war. He later walked that back, but it stood for about a week. And his National Security Advisor and Secretary of State were unwilling to say during that period of time that Ukraine had not started the war. And even to the point of publicly humiliating Zelensky in the White House, as we saw, and withdrawing US military hardware support, intelligence support, and financial support in a seeming effort to force Ukraine and Zelensky to capitulate to Russia on Vladimir Putin's terms. So here's the data point that I think is inarguable, and that is the United Nations about 3 weeks ago had a vote where the resolution simply was to condemn Russia for being the aggressor against Ukraine in the Russia-Ukraine war. And a handful of countries voted against that resolution. Again, against a resolution condemning Russia for aggressing against Ukraine. Russia was one of the countries that voted against it. So were we. We voted against that resolution with Russia, with Vladimir Putin, and with North Korea and Belarus and a couple of other countries of that type. Every one of our NATO allies voted for the resolution. Every one of our Asian allies voted for the resolution, but the United States alone among our allies voted with Vladimir Putin against Ukraine. We've never seen anything like that in our history. And the punchline to this is that even China didn't vote against the resolution. China abstained. They didn't vote against it. They couldn't bring themselves to vote for it, but they were ahead of us in standing with Ukraine by abstaining. So we have now validated as a nation the Chinese position on Russia-Ukraine, and of course even more, we've validated the Russian position on Russia-Ukraine to a very striking degree. So these are the areas, Taiwan, TikTok, human rights, Russia-Ukraine, that are good examples of areas where we now have specific data points, mostly in the form of statements from President Trump himself and US actions, that make it clear that this is a much more conciliatory, and some would say, and I would say in some cases, capitulatory stance toward China than we have seen in history in some of these cases. So hardline, conciliatory, They're both there. And what I would say as I wrap this part up is to simply say, I think it is at this time unclear where the U.S. approach overall toward China is going to go over the next 4 years, because there are these elements that are in tension with each other. And it's too early to say whether we're going to end up in a great place with China based on whatever set of policies, or in a worse place. If I were prognosticating, I would say there is a slim likelihood that U.S.-China relations might get better to a degree, partly because we're starting to see things eye to eye with Beijing on their terms on some of these issues. But there is a greater chance that we, I think, will see a more or less the same trajectory that we've seen, and probably some level of further deterioration in the relationship based on some of the hardline things that are playing out, including in terms of trade. So it's a mixed bag, and we're going to have to see how things play out. Let me say, and I'll keep this part somewhat brief here, let me say a little bit about the underlying assumptions. Normally, when I do this talk, and this is pretty new, I've been talking about this just for a few weeks. This is kind of the latest version of my stump speech on U.S.-China relations, and it changes all the time because the dynamics change and the circumstances change. But I'll give you the short version of this next section, and that is going under the hood and looking at the underlying strategic assumptions that we, the United States, are making about China that has prompted us to make different policy choices than we historically have made, predating the last 10 years. And why is it that we're making different choices? My argument is that it's because we have different assumptions about China than we did 10, 15, or 20 years ago. And the point that I want to make at the outset is that the efficacy of any public policy is generally never going to be far removed from the accuracy of the strategic assumptions that undergird that policy. So if you formulate policy based on accurate assumptions about who you're dealing with or about the world, then the likelihood that the policy is going to do what you want it to do is fairly high. If you, on the other hand, make assumptions that are incorrect, then the policies that result from those flawed assumptions are unlikely to do what you want them to do. And that's why the assumptions piece is very important. I'll be brief here, briefer than I would like to be, but just for the sake of time and finishing up on time, which I've been directed to do. And I will stay for a little bit afterwards. I have a radio interview this evening, but otherwise I'd stay for longer than anybody here until I wore out my welcome. But I'll be able to stay for 20 or 25 minutes after the fact for those who may have questions or disagreements and want to talk to me or violently disagree with my entire analysis, etc. But let me give you the brief version. I think there are 7 key assumptions that have radically changed in the last 10 to 15 years. And I want to just go through those quickly before doing a brief few words on looking at the efficacy of our policies as measured against whether we have achieved our own stated objectives as a nation. So the seven assumptions are, and this will be kind of telegraphic bullet points. We used to assume, this is number 1, we used to assume that China was a partner of the United States. But now we assume that China is an enemy of the United States. When I say we, I mean official Washington, the elected political class of our nation, and it crosses the partisan aisle. It started on the Republican side much more heavily than on the Democratic side, but it's fair to say that it is bipartisan at this point. That a lot of official Washington, that all of official Washington essentially regards China as the enemy of our nation. That is a fundamentally different starting point and assumption than the idea that China was a partner, albeit a partner with whom we disagreed on a bunch of things, but a partner with whom we could work. So from partner to enemy, that's the first change in assumptions. The second assumption shift is that we used to believe it was in the long-term interest, national interest of the United States to engage China. Now we seem to believe, when I say we, again, official Washington, seems to believe that it is in the long-term interest of the United States to disengage from China. That is a radical change in what we assume. We assumed that engagement was good. Now we assume that disengagement is good. The third area is that we used to assume that China was content to be a major power in the world with all of the accoutrements associated with that, but a power that was content not to challenge the United States for primacy or supremacy in the world. So that China was a big, important, hefty, major player, but it was not seeking to develop capabilities in a way that challenged our primacy. Today, official Washington assumes that China seeks to displace and supplant the United States of America as the world's only superpower as we define the term superpower. That's what official Washington thinks. Four, we used to believe that China considered itself a stakeholder in the international system. And as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council with veto authority, it could make sure that the UN would never do anything significant that it didn't want done by virtue of the veto authority. As a member of the WTO for almost the last 25 years, it was in the system. And as a member of the G20 and various other major formal and governmental and international and informal groupings, China was right there in the mix for all of this and was content for the system to work the way that the system has always worked in recent decades. Now the assumption is that China wants to overturn the entire rules-based international order and turn it into something that presumably is somehow more friendly to the interests of autocracies like China, and for that matter, Russia and other countries, and that China wants to get rid of basically the post-World War II international system that to a large degree the United States created. And just as a parenthetical point, I always find it interesting, and it's hard not to smile when anyone operates on the assumption that somehow the current international system is not friendly to authoritarian regimes, because in fact, it is very friendly to authoritarian regimes, and we see that. And China wouldn't have attained what it has attained but for the international system allowing China, for good or ill, to do what China does and so on. Same for Russia, same for North Korea, same for Iran. Authoritarian countries like China do very well under the current international system. It's worked well for them, and yet the belief is somehow they want to change it. The fifth area is that we used to assume that mutual dependence between major powers was good and stabilizing. And now the official Washington assumes that mutual dependence between major powers is bad and destabilizing, and we should cut ties and reduce our real or perceived dependence on authoritarian or other adversarial countries so as not to be somehow unduly beholden to them or vulnerable to them. It is a 180-degree sea change in the way we think about it. Under the old thinking, the idea was when major countries depend on each other and are integrated in terms of economics and trade, there is less of a likelihood that those countries will go into war with each other. But when they're separated, there is a greater likelihood that that could happen. But that's not the thinking that we have today. The last 2 points in terms of assumptions are that we used to believe that and assume that mutual benefit was possible when the United States and China worked together on issue A or issue B, that it was possible for the United States and China, this was the assumption, to work together, whether on trade or climate change or the issue of North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons or any number of other issues, the Iranian nuclear issue, piracy on the high seas, and both countries could win at the same time. In other words, mutual benefit. Today, without question, the United States believes, and I would say China also believes, that it is a zero-sum game. And spoken from an American standpoint, if China wins, we lose by definition. by definition. And if we win, China loses. There is no such thing as both countries coming away and both winning. It's not possible when you're dealing with the framework of a zero-sum mindset. And it causes me to mention a quip that I sometimes make in my talks, and it reminds me of the old joke about how do you know when so-and-so is lying? And the answer is when his lips are moving. And in Washington, to apply that logic to China, how do you know when China is doing something bad? And the answer is when it's doing something. When it's doing something, it's doing something bad. That's what Washington believes about China. And that's the zero-sum mindset. And in fairness, I think China is now viewing us with very much a zero-sum prism as well. And the last point that I would make in terms of changed assumptions, and I'll wrap up here shortly, is that we used to believe that an overall moderate positioning on China, notwithstanding major and I would say permanent disagreements with China on a whole host of issues, from Taiwan to the South China Sea to human rights to the issue of Xinjiang and the treatment of the Uyghurs to Hong Kong to the proper role of a state in managing a domestic economy or international trade. Despite irreconcilable differences in all of those areas, we used to believe that a moderate policy approach to China gave America our best chance of achieving our goals relative to China. But now official Washington seems to believe that, at least this was true up until January 20th, and I have to be mindful of that, and it may still be true now, but we'll see how it plays out. Now we seem to believe that only a hard line approach is going to generate results on certain issues. And so we've adopted, historically, over the last 8 years, Trump and Biden, a hardline approach on China. Now, let me just say a few words about the bottom line results. And if I honestly would need 20 minutes to go through this, but I'm going to try to do it in about 2 minutes and then conclude so that we have approximately 20 minutes for Q&A and discussion. In the end, I come from a school of thought that contends that the only thing that actually matters is the bottom line results for the American people and the bottom line results for our nation. I was a diplomat. I worked in the State Department under 4 different presidents, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. And all of them agreed that advancing America's national interests was the metric that needed to be used to evaluate the efficacy of foreign policy. And presidents long before the presidents who were president when I was in government felt the same way. So the question I pose is, how well are the policies that Trump and Biden have put in place serving the United States? And let me just reel off a few bullet points much more quickly than I would like to, because this is, you know, that line from the Al Pacino movie, I'm just getting warmed up. This is where I would normally be just getting warmed up, because I think this is a story that hasn't been told honestly to the American people. But that said, I'll give you a few bullet points. And I'm talking about Trump and Biden, ultimately, 8 years of policy continuity. Number one, under Donald Trump, we generated the largest trade deficit with China in our nation's history under his policies. Number two, in Donald Trump's presidency, we attained the highest ever average annual merchandise deficit with any country in America's history, in the history of every president. By using an average figure, you can compare presidencies of different lengths. John F. Kennedy's, LBJ's, 2-term presidents, 1-term presidents. Trump had the highest average annual merchandise deficit with China of any country, the highest deficit with any country America has ever had under his presidency. Under both Trump and Biden, we attained the highest, 7 in a row, the highest U.S. trade deficit with the world that we have ever achieved. We set the record in 2018, we beat it in 2019, we beat it in 2020, and again in 21, 22, 23, and 24. 7 successive years of record high deficits with the world as a result of the policies that Trump and Biden put in place, and in Biden's case, kept in place. Both are complicit in that result. Meanwhile, none of the trade problems that the tariffs were supposed to resolve were resolved. And every study that's looked at, and including Republican studies and Democratic studies, because again, you have one Republican and one Democrat during this period of time, said none of these problems have been solved by any of the things that we've done, and that's why we still have them. By the way, that's why President Trump wants to now increase tariffs, because after all, if the problems had been solved, we wouldn't need tariffs anymore. So the very fact that he believes we need tariffs is an admission that none of this has worked. On human rights, it was on President Trump's watch that China began rounding up 1 million Uyghurs and putting them in camps surrounded by barbed wire that they couldn't leave of their own volition. Something that Trump's Secretary of State called a genocide. Mr. Pompeo used the word genocide. So Trump, during his 4 years, presided over the first instance of genocide, according to his own Secretary of State, during those 4 years. It was on President Trump's watch during those 4 years that China adopted the national security law in Hong Kong that rolled back democratic and expression freedoms in June of 2020 when Trump was president. It was on Trump's and Biden's watch that China's deplorable and shameful human rights picture got much worse, according to the Trump State Department's human rights reports and according to the Biden State Department's human rights reports. It was during these 8 years that China became vastly more aggressive toward Taiwan than it has ever been in its modern history. It was during this 8-year period that China became vastly more aggressive in the South China Sea than it has ever been in its modern history, according to Trump's and Biden's defense departments. They themselves said that. And it was during this time that China actually, according to American experts that know a lot more about this than I do, caught up with the United States on AI technology with the rolling out of DeepSeek, China's AI application, artificial intelligence application that poetically was rolled out on Inauguration Day, January 20th, 2025. And on top of all of this, we've now embraced the Chinese and Russian positions on the Russia-Ukraine war. And as I said, we've even gone further than China in standing with dictator Vladimir Putin. And the last point I would make briefly is that on top of all of it, Chinese sentiment toward the United States is at an all-time low. Now, the only thing I would say is, in what universe do any of these results constitute success from an American standpoint relative to our relationship with China? And the answer is they don't. And my view is very bipartisan, a pox on both their houses, both President Trump and President Biden, because under the policies of the last 8 years, this is what they themselves and their administrations have said is the situation with China. It's not me. The reason I couch my presentation by citing the Trump State Department, the Biden State Department, the Trump trade figures, the Biden trade figures, not my views. What I'm saying is they themselves have put the record on the table that makes it clear that we have achieved none of the things that we wanted to achieve as a nation. No US president, not Donald Trump, not Joe Biden, or anybody else, wakes up in the morning and says, let's generate the highest deficit we've ever had in our country, the largest deficit with the world we've ever had, the greatest human rights debacle that we've seen in the modern history of the world, what we, the Trump administration, call genocide. Let's have Russia and China form an incredible bond so that Russia can invade Ukraine with impunity. No president wakes up and says that they want those things to happen, but every one of those things happened. So the point that I would make, just to briefly conclude here, is to say we need to look at the issue of China and understand how important it is that we get it right, because the consequences of getting it wrong are far-reaching and very unpleasant. And we need to have an honest conversation with ourselves in this country as to whether our policies are generating the results that the people who implement those policies say that they want to see. Because if that is the metric, we're not getting it done. And part of it is because we have flawed assumptions. So if we can be more critical in our own thought process and our own discourse, if we can make better assumptions about China's motivations and about the world, if we can keep our eyes on the prize of the long-term national interests of the United States of America and not the next tweet 4 seconds from now, then I think it is possible that we can avoid worst outcomes, worst case scenarios, we can avoid war, and we can keep this relationship on the rails. And if we do those things, I believe we can and we will be able to compete with China more effectively, win more often, and give our children and grandchildren the US-China relationship and the future that they deserve. Thank you.
We have a couple of microphones here. If you have a question, please raise your hand.
Yeah, and students first if possible, and then definitely members of the general public as well. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, would you say that the US's increasing rate of paranoia, as well as just allowing China to commit these crimes and, as you said, genocide, like, are we just further weaponizing China to then like manifest this paranoia into actually taking place?
Well, I would say a couple of things. First of all, thank you for your question. And what I would say is the things that I just described weren't happening before the last 8 years. So I think at some point, again, we have to ask ourselves, is there causality between the tonality and the substance of our policy and results that we ourselves have said we're unhappy with? And by the way, we've rightly said that we're unhappy with. And so I do think that, to answer your question, there's one particular example that I think illustrates the problem. The United States, under both President Trump, it started with President Trump in 2017 when he took office, but it continued with President Biden. We have really demonized China rhetorically. We have used, in many cases, vitriolic and incendiary language in talking about China and their presumed motivations and intentions. In essence, official Washington have described China in terms that would be used to describe Nazi Germany and have described Xi Jinping in the way that we would describe Adolf Hitler. And that has driven China away from us and frankly into the closest relationship with Russia that China has ever had. I would make the argument that Russia would not have invaded Ukraine in February of 2022 had the United States not so pushed China away from a functional relationship with us. And remember when this happened, it was in the wake of and during COVID-19, a time when Donald Trump as president said that China had poisoned us, that it had done this to us intentionally, that it was trying to wipe us out, and even referring to COVID-19 in Donald Trump's terms as, quote, Kung flu, as he put it in a tweet. And we saw this avalanche of incendiary and I would say racially charged rhetoric, which at the time I condemned publicly. I was the first person in this country in the US-China nonprofit space to do that. But I thought it was very unhelpful to us and just wrong and beneath the dignity of the office of President of the United States to have someone saying, quote, Kung flu, unquote. And I would argue that it's because we did that China ended up in this relationship with Russia. And it's because they're in this special, what they call no limits partnership, that Russia felt emboldened and empowered to aggress against Ukraine, knowing that it had China's support lined up on the basis of a summit that took place between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping in early February of 2022. So are we creating the monster? To some degree, we are. Is China also doing deplorable things that are bad for us and that we should have a problem with? Absolutely. But we're making it worse with our policies, not better. That's why I cited the empirical record, the data from the administrations in question, not my data, their data, that shows that we're not actually attaining any of our objectives. So China owns what it does, and it does some things that I sharply disagree with and have been prolifically critical of, including tonight and on many occasions. But in the end, we have to recognize that the only thing that we can actually control is us. And it's like the two sprinters in lane 1 and lane 2. We're in lane 1, China's in lane 2. And for the last 10 years, or certainly 8 years, we've been sitting in lane 1 looking as the gun is about to go off over at lane 2 and asking ourselves, how do we get them to run slower? But what we should be doing is asking ourselves, how do we make ourselves run faster? Because we don't have any control over how fast they run. And we've got to focus on us if we're going to have any chance of outcompeting and winning against this formidable competitor. Sir, you had a question, and then we'll come down here, and then also general public. Yes, sir.
Sir, you spoke about the issues of the tariffs under both administrations being a failure in terms of what they hope to achieve. What would you recommend we utilize in the future regarding geoeconomics in terms of tactics?
That's a great question, and I would say a few things. Let me just start with a quick analogy. The analogy that I've used since 2018 is that you've got these problems with China, and let's equate it to a Dollar General store. Let's say you're the general manager of a Dollar General store, and you have a $5,000 a year shoplifting problem. So you call a security company and you pay them $25,000 to fix $25,000 a year to fix your $5,000 problem. That's what we've done. We have fixed a problem by creating a solution that is far worse than the original problem was. So what other presidents, both Republican and Democrats, understood is that there isn't a quick and easy fix to the problem of the real transgressions on the part of China in terms of unfair trade practices, because they do engage in unfair trade practices. They do things that are illegal under the WTO, that's for sure. By the way, so do we. All the Trump tariffs were ruled illegal under the WTO. So it's true that China cheats and does all kinds of things that are wrong. But it's also true that in response to that, we're now doing the same things. So the solution, the Peterson Institute, probably the most respected nonpartisan economic and trade think tank in the world, and certainly in the United States, put out a study about 2 to 3 years ago. It was either 22 or 23, I think it was 2022. And they said at that time, if the Trump administration had done nothing, that the United States would have been in a much better place from an income and trade standpoint and deficit standpoint than having, quote, solved the problem, unquote, with tariffs. So what should we do? We should be much more surgical in trying to open up markets where they're closed to us. We should enter into what used to be negotiations over a bilateral investment treaty, or BIT, that would have opened up investment in ways that would have benefited both sides. We should allow companies to make decisions and be answerable to their boards of directors rather than engaging in central planning, which is what we as a nation are doing now, telling our companies what they can sell, when they can sell it, what they can transfer, when they can transfer it. Get back to the principles that made us the #1 economy in the history of the world, the #1 technology superpower in the history of the world, the #1 innovation superpower in the history of the planet Earth, and recognize that the way we got here was not by emulating Chinese worst practices as best practices to be copycatted. The way we got here was by being true to the values that have been true through administrations of both parties. Get the government out of the way and let companies do what they do best, and let the American customer have the best product that's available on the market. And be more targeted as you deal with specific issues and work through the WTO to solve the trade issues that are out there. A lot more could be said about it, but those are some of the ways. I guess I would say it's the equivalent of the short version. I'll end this answer with this. It's the Hippocratic oath. Do no harm. First, do no harm. Or there's also, I guess, the shovel oath. If you're in a hole and you're digging and you're worried about the hole getting too deep, stop digging. And that's what we need to do to start getting back on the right track. And the ultimate metric is not China. I don't give a damn what they think about any of this stuff. The ultimate metric is, how are we doing? How is our country performing? How are our incomes looking? What does our industry look like? What do cars cost? The tariffs that are being contemplated now with Canada and Mexico are going to make an average vehicle in this country go up by $15,000 overnight. $15,000. Now, to some in this room, maybe that's not a big figure. To many of our fellow Americans, it is a big figure. We shouldn't be doing this to ourselves. I'm very much against tariffs, whether it's Trump or Biden, and both of them did it. Both of them did it, and it's not good for our country. Yes, sir, sorry. And I know we're coming up on time, and I'll be deferential to Max. Maybe this will be the last formal question, but I will stick around because I want to talk more with all of you, and I'll be here tomorrow too, and would love to engage more. Please, sir.
So earlier in lecture, you talked to us about how the U.S. wants to be the sole world power, while China and Russia are only looking to advance themselves and be the best. Do you believe that Trump's dissolution of the USAID and then the tariffs placed on close allies, Mexico, Canada, and then China, the rest of the world, and then voting against, the rest of the world's interest with condemning Russia. Do you believe these recent foreign international policies have ousted the U.S. as a world leader that smaller nations look up to for help, and also as an ally and a world leader?
It's a great question, and it's one I've been thinking a lot about lately. And in short, look, I'm not coming at this through a partisan lens because I'm highly critical of presidents of both parties, including the current president and his predecessor. But I do believe that the things that we're doing now and have been doing since January 20th are definitely creating a vacuum in the world that is going to be filled by someone that we probably don't want to fill it, whether it's dismantling USAID and leaving development assistance there for the Chinese to come into through the Belt and Road Initiative and so on, whether it's terminating the Voice of America, which actually very few people here listen to, but people in China to some degree still do rely on it as a source of information in an otherwise highly controlled media environment, whether it's declaring a trade war against Canada of all countries in the world. I just had never dreamed I'd wake up and see that any president of any party or any political persuasion would declare a trade war at the level of 25% tariffs against the Canadians of all people. I can't even say it with a straight face. Or the Mexicans. Yeah, I think these things are hurting the United States. There's no question about it. The loudest clinking of champagne glasses that has been heard subsequent to each of these actions has come from Beijing and Moscow. They are rejoicing. They're saying it. They're actually saying the part you're not supposed to say out loud. Literally, officials, president spokesman in Moscow, foreign ministry in China, and other officials are literally coming out and saying, I can't believe you guys are doing this stuff, but thank you. And my rule of thumb in international affairs is when China and Russia love what we're doing, we're probably doing something wrong. Thanks, y'all. Really appreciate it.